Good evening, everyone. Hi. They can hear me in the lobby, so I'll give them a second to get in here. While that's happening, though, thank you all so much for being here this evening. We really appreciate you coming out for our special guest, who's in from Chicago and then going back to New York after this. We really appreciate him taking a detour down here to Atlanta for the meantime. For those of you I have not met, my name is Claire Haley. I'm the Vice President of Public Relations and Programs here for the History Center. And this is one of my favorite parts of my job, is getting to talk to such amazing authors like we have tonight in Yascha Mounk and getting to interact with all of you. I see several of you have your copy of the book, but if you don't, they're 25% off tonight only, and Yascha will be signing them after the event, so we'll hope that you'll stop by the signing table there. I'm going to briefly introduce tonight's guests, and we're going to jump right into the conversation. Please note that tonight's conversation is being recorded. It's also being live streamed, so hi, Mom. And if you, we'll have audience questions at the end. So my colleague will come around with the mic, and we do ask that you ask the question into the mic because that's how we pick it up on the recording. Great. So Yascha Mounk is a writer and academic known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. He was born in Germany to Polish parents, received his BA from Trinity College, University of Cambridge, and PhD in government from Harvard University, so studying in a few different continents there. He is now professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University and the founder of Persuasion. And he is a contributing editor at The Atlantic, where you've probably read a lot of his work, and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So Yascha, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure. And I mean, isn't it nice? I know that there's a little bit of a resurgence going on of COVID and so on, but isn't it nice to be in a room with people again? I have to say, I'm not quite over it yet. It's really great.
Mm-hmm. It's actually be able to see the people that you're talking to instead of just looking at a reflection of yourself on a screen. It's kind of nice. So given the resurgence of COVID, we're glad you're all here, but we also thought you'd appreciate having a little bit of space to spread out. So thank you. So Yascha, this book, when I started reading it, I said, I thought he promised me a little bit of optimism. And then I found the optimism at the end. But you wrote a book a few years ago on the crisis of populism. Now you're moving on to why diverse democracies fall apart. What led you from one to the other? And when did you start this book, out of curiosity?
So why don't I start with the last book and then put this book in conversation with the last one, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, when I was in grad school, I was interested in political systems around the world and why some countries are democracies and why some other countries are dictatorships and why they sometimes transition from one to the other. And basically what I read in the literature and what my professors told me was that there's some dictatorships that turn out to be pretty stable, right? China is now a pretty affluent country. It's been around for a long time. It's going through a big crisis right now, but it doesn't seem to show any signs of becoming a democracy. And the same is true for Saudi Arabia or the UAE and all kinds of places, right? There's a lot of democracies that are quite unstable. So if you're quite a poor country, if you don't have a very long democratic tradition, then nobody is surprised if you try to build democratic institutions and that fails. Sadly, that's often happened. And we're seeing that today in many parts of the world. But I was told, there's a set of countries that are very affluent, a set of countries that have had this long democratic tradition, but have had many changes of government for free and fair election. And in those countries, democracy is really safe. So Germany, where I grew up, is one of those. The United States, obviously, is one of those, and many others around the world. And so in those countries, supposedly, you could sort of fast forward 25, 50, 100 years, and you'd know the political institutions would basically still be the same. And I was starting to look out at the world and think, I don't know that that's exactly right, because there's all of these signs that seemed a little bit worrying to me. In many countries at the time, there was declining participation in politics. When I started looking at some polls with a friend and colleague, Roberto Foa, it turned out that people gave a lot less importance to living in a democracy than they had done previously. And that they're more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. That they're more open to army rule or to a strongman leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections. And so we thought, hang on a second, might it be possible that democracy could actually come under threat in some of those countries. And so I started to worry in particular about the sort of new crop of politicians that was becoming much more powerful in many countries around the world, which were called authoritarian populists. Now, these terms in political science can be a little misleading. The problem is not trying to be popular. That's what any good democratic politician does. But it's to say that they alone truly represent the people. That's what's meant by that in political science. If you're a populist, it means I truly represent the people, and if you disagree with me, then you're illegitimate. There's something wrong with you. And you saw the rise of those politicians in many countries around the world, in India with Narendra Modi, in Turkey with Recep Erdogan, in Hungary with Viktor Orban, in Russia with Vladimir Putin. And so I was really starting to worry about the way in which that might undermine the stability of our democracies. And I think everything we've seen since I started worrying about that around 2013, 2014, 2015, sort of shows that was prescient. Because when you look at the amount of political polarization division we have now in so many Western democracies, including the United States, and the fact that I have my account of what puts American democracy in danger, you might have a very different account, but we probably both agree that American democracy is in danger. So the extent to which we're seeing this mistrust and this dysfunction and this hatred in our political system, I think, is very worrying. And so then I was trying to explain in my last book, The People versus Democracy, why is all of this happening, right? And so one reason why this is happening is the stagnation of living standards for a lot of ordinary folk, right? In the United States, from 1935 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. But since 1985, it's been more or less stagnant. Perhaps it's gone up a little bit for the last few years. Now it may be stagnating again because of inflation. It depends a little bit on how you count. But definitely it has not doubled, right? It's pretty much where it was 30 years ago. So that's important. You see the rise of the internet and of social media and the way in which that makes it easier to vilify people and say, we completely disagree with you, and in fact, you're just a traitor, you're an enemy of the people, and all those kinds of things. But there's also this third kind of thing that I was thinking about, and that is a set of demographic and to some extent cultural changes that we've seen in the last decades, which are making democracies that either were quite homogeneous, they were quite mono-ethnic and monocultural, like Germany when I grew up there, or that had always been quite diverse, that had always had a lot of different ethnic and religious groups within them, but that used to exclude one group in very clear and extreme ways. And now they are very ethnically and religiously diverse. They have lots of different ethnic and religious groups within them. And they're trying to treat people as equals, right? They're trying to include everybody equally in the political system. And that's actually something new. There really isn't any real precedent for that. And so I argued in my last book, that's one of the things that's going on. That's one of the things that's explaining this moment of tension in our politics. But I thought, this is really such a crucial point, and it's such a novel endeavor that it deserves a book of its own. And so that's what the meaning of a great experiment of this book is. That's what this book is about.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned earlier that political scientists have all these words that they like to use, like populism is a little misleading. So I thought we could just go over a few of the terms that you use throughout this book, just so that we can make sure we're all, on the same page and I don't get emails that I'm saying liberal too many times. So I was curious about, there's a couple of things. First of all, you don't talk about as much in this book, but in The People versus Democracy, you give a really interesting definition of democracy itself. You separate it from the institutions that sometimes we often think of as being central to democracy, and say, nope, it's just that the will of the people is being translated into public policy, right? So democracy, and then in this case, when we're talking about liberalism, can you explain a little bit about what that means, what we're talking about when we say that?
Yeah, so political scientists love to talk about liberal democracy. And liberal is a really confusing word because it means different things in different places, right? I lived in France for a year. In France, liberal means being right-wing on economics, right? What they mean by liberal is the state shouldn't interfere in the economy. And so if you say you're a liberal, you're kind of like a Chamber of Commerce Republican or something like that, whatever the closest, French equivalent of that is, right? And then obviously in the United States, liberal just tend to mean like you're a lefty, right? You're a progressive, you're on the left politically. So the word is really contested and is really confusing. But why do political scientists talk about liberal democracy? They're trying to express the same thing that many conservatives try to express when we talk about a democratic republic, right? So why do we need these two terms? Because our political system has two goals. And I think to be just, our political system needs to guarantee both of those goals at the same time, right? So one is democracy, right? One is the rule of the people, right? We think that we want governed by the people, for the people, and so on, right? Which is to say, we don't want a monarch or a priest or an imam or army general telling us what to do. We want to live in a political system where collectively, through the institutions that we have control over our own fate, right? And so there's some amount of collective self-determination. So that's the democratic element of it. But we also want something else, because we don't want a political system in which the majority can vote to come and take away your house. We don't want a system in which the majority can come and lock you up for saying something they don't like. We don't want a system in which the majority can tell you how you should worship, right? So we also want individual rights. We also want some sphere of our life in which we're protected against the interference of a government or of a majority of our fellow citizens. And so that's what political science means by liberal democracy. Liberal there refers to those individual rights and so on. If you prefer, you can say it's a democratic republic. It's what explains that we live not just in a pure democracy, but in a republic. But those two sort of ways of talking get to the same thing. It's where we want collective self-determination, but also individual freedom and individual rights, where we want a political system that somehow combines both of those goals.
Would you hold your mic closer?
Sure, I can try and do that, yes.
Thank you. So you explain the liberal democracy or democratic republic. You also, in this book, you talk about political systems, you talk about policy, but you also talk a little bit about history and a little bit about human nature. So I wanted to pull a quote from the beginning of, or towards the beginning of the book, when you're talking about the human tendency to form groups. And so I'd love for us to talk a little bit about why this is important. So you said that when you were growing up, I thought there was something artificial about the human tendency to form groups and discriminate against outsiders. If it weren't for history or prejudice, for hateful politicians or cynical demagogues, we would all be able to get along. When you got a little bit older, you decided, well, maybe that's not so true. Maybe there's a little bit something more to it. So this book focuses on countries' ability to, or not to, adapt to increasing demographic diversity. So can you talk a little bit about why you changed your mind about human tendency to form groups and why that matters in this broader discussion?
Yeah, so is this better? Can you hear me better? All right, I will sort of get a little uncomfortably close to this microphone. Look, I grew up in Europe. My family is Jewish, and so my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents experienced very closely what it means for this groupish instincts that we have as humans to go wrong, right? What it means when one group decides to turn on another. And so when I was growing up, sort of both the way that my parents lived and the kind of way in which they encouraged me to think about the world was that we shouldn't define ourselves by groups, right? We shouldn't define ourselves by what ethnic group we happen to belong to or what kind of community we're born into, but to try and think of ourselves as individuals, right? As people who go through life on our own, trying to figure out what we think is right and how we want to live and what's important to us. And I think that there's something important to that, right? There's also something important to recognizing that there's many people who we don't have ties to who we should care for, right? It might come more naturally to me to be upset if there's an earthquake one town over. But if there's an earthquake very far away in the world and people are suffering and I can do something about that, I should also care to help. I think that's part of what's human, what's moral, and I continue to believe that. But the more I learned about history and the more I learned about human psychology, the more I realized that this idea that most people are going to not think of themselves as members of group, or that I myself actually I'm not motivated in some ways by the groups I'm a part of. It's just naive. It just goes against how human beings tend to work. So I tell the story in the book of Henry Teifel, who is a social psychologist who tries to figure out, he works, he does his most important work in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and he's trying to figure out what went wrong in World War II. And he has the same thought that my parents had in a way, which is, look, a lot of what went wrong here is these groups hating each other and murdering each other and doing these terrible things to each other, right? And so here we want to understand why. What is it about groups that makes people capable of in-group favoritism, sometimes great altruism towards members of your own group, but also often out-group discrimination, terrible treatment of people outside the group. And so he had a really interesting idea. He said, look, to figure this out, I'm going to create these groups that are really silly and pointless, and their members are not going to favor each other because the groups are too silly for that. And then I can slowly add features to the groups until people start to discriminate against each other. And that'll tell us something about what makes those groups tick, right? What makes them so powerful. So he got a bunch of teenagers into the lab in Bristol in England, and he showed them a sheet of paper with a bunch of dots on it. And he had them guess how many dots are on the sheet of paper. And so some said 130 and some said 170. I was like, great, all right. So I'm going to split you into a group of underestimators and into a group of overestimators. You play these games against each other. And what happens? The underestimators start to discriminate against the overestimaters. And the overestimators start to discriminate against the underestimaters.
Immediately, right.
Immediately. Now, I teach at a wonderful campus, incredibly diverse, with some of the students who think of themselves as the most tolerant people in the world. And in some ways they are, in some ways perhaps they're not. But I ask them whether a hot dog is a sandwich. And when I have them debate whether a hot dog is a sandwich, and when I have them play the same kind of game that Teifel had his kids play. And it turns out that the students who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against those who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich. So this instinct to favor to form groups really easily and to favor the in-group over the out-group is a human universal. You see it in any context. And it can be inspiring. It can be what makes us capable of altruism, what makes us capable of building beautiful cathedrals or beautiful mosques, beautiful works of art, and all the kinds of things that celebrate our group, our culture, and all of that. But it can also be incredibly dangerous. And in history, we've seen that particularly when those groups, when the lines between those groups are drawn along religious lines, along ethnic lines, along racial lines, sometimes along national lines, that can motivate some of the worst wars and civil wars and forms of ethnic cleansing and genocides that we've seen. And so one question is, we're never going to be able to overcome this groupishness, but how do we deal with it? How do we handle it in such a way that it doesn't tear us apart, that it doesn't lead to those tragedies we've so often seen in history?
So you go on to discuss, after you talk about that groupish tendency, it comes up again and again in the rest of the book because it's so central, as you said, to how humans interact with one another and therefore how they interact with their government. There was a really interesting discussion in here about patriotism and how, that groupish tendency, sometimes patriotism can have either very positive or very negative connotations depending on who you're talking to and how they've experienced what someone else might have defined as patriotism, right, in their lives. But you talk about how patriotism can actually be used as a way to help people feel like they belong to the same country, even if, we're here in Georgia. What do we feel like we have in common with someone who lives in Alaska, right? How do we find that common ground, and how do we feel that we all have a mutual responsibility to each other? So you talk about a couple different forms of patriotism, but one I found really interesting was cultural patriotism. Because you talk about how there's, the really nationalistic patriotism. Then there's the patriotism where we try to aspire to higher ideals by our founding documents, maybe in the United States, or by just ideas in general, but sometimes that doesn't actually get people really excited, right? Sometimes not a lot of people get together and are really excited to talk about the Constitution, right? But they are really excited to get together and talk about football or a TV show or what happened last night on SNL or whatever it is. So can you talk about cultural patriotism and how you've seen that change over time and what role you think that plays in a diverse democracy?
Yeah, so look, again, I grew up as a German Jew, so patriotism doesn't come naturally to me in a way, right? And again, when I was 20, I think I hoped that we would live in a world in which patriotism becomes less and less important, in which perhaps nations become less and less important. And when you look at the world today, you can certainly see that there are some forms of nationalism which remain very dangerous, right? Vladimir Putin, in invading Ukraine, is motivated by ideas of a grandeur of a Russian nation. And it is causing these terrible and unnecessary forms of suffering. And so I think there is always something dangerous to nationalism when it's understood in the wrong way and when it's exploited by the worst kinds of people. But I've also come to conclude over the last decades a couple of things, a couple of reasons why it's important. One is that it can also sustain this amazing forms of solidarity, right? Putin's is one form of nationalism, but Ukrainians are also at the moment motivated by an incredibly powerful form of patriotism. The fact that they've been able to defend themselves, and the fact that millions of people are serving the Ukrainian army voluntarily right now. They don't have conscription yet. It's voluntary, and people are risking their lives to defend their homeland and to defend their ideals. That also can be patriotism, right? When you are thinking about a country like the United States, right, with so many different cultural and religious and ethnic groups, if all of our identities are just the community you grew up in and people who look similar to you and people who have the same faith, then the danger that we're going to fall apart, I think, is very, very real. And so having something above that level, something where we say, okay, look, we have all those differences, but also there's a level where we're Americans together and where we have that solidarity is really, really important. And so I think of patriotism or nationalism as a kind of half domesticated animal. It can become really dangerous if you sort of stoke it and then it can run wild, or you can domesticate it and make it useful and make it serve a really important role. And the question is how to do that, right? So then historically, there's three kinds of conceptions of what that might look like. And the first is an ethnic conception that has been very dominant historically in Europe and powerful in the United States as well, right? And that's to say, look, a real German, a real American, a real Frenchman, a real Swede is somebody who comes from the same ethnic stock, somebody who has grandparents and great-grandparents who are part of a majority group who've already lived in the territory of this country, and so people who've come in or people who belong to these minorities, they don't really belong, right? Now, that obviously is a notion that I reject. I don't think you have to have that common ethnic descent to have this form of solidarity with each other. I think those forms of ethnic nationalism exclude many of the people who live in all of the countries I mentioned today and who were born there, who speak the language, who make great contributions to it. And I think it's that kind of ethnic nationalism that's most likely to inspire the sorts of war of aggression that we're seeing in Russia, right? Because we're saying there's something special about my ethnicity, when it's easy to think, well, and these other nations don't really count and they're not really important, right? So then there's a second notion, which has historically been the one that sort of, nice professors from fancy institutions on the East Coast tend to go to if they have to defend patriotism at all, right? And that's a civic or constitutional patriotism. That's to say that what it is to be American is to believe in the importance of the Constitution, of the Declaration of Independence, of the Bill of Rights. It's to say that we're defined by a common creed, by a set of shared principles. Now, I was proud to become a United citizen about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was proud to swear to defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that is in part because I do lay a lot of store by the Constitution, by these civic documents. That is one of the things that made it exciting to me to become an American, that attracted me to this country and to the choice of becoming a citizen. So I think that all of this is right and important. That has to be an important part of what it is to be a member of a healthy nation. And it helps to explain, for example, why the Russians, unfortunately not very many, but those Russians that have been at great risk to themselves protesting against the war in Ukraine over the last weeks and months, are true patriots, right? They're not traitors to their nation. They're saying, not in our name, not in the name of our nation. That's not what Russia should stand for. So I think that this kind of form of civic patriotism can be very important. But if we just base ourselves on that, I don't think it's going to work. And that's because most people just don't care that much about politics. And when most people say, I love my country, I love America, they're not thinking about some document from 250 years ago. We might want that as people who had the History Center, but this is not how most people think, right? And so what is it that they connect to their country? It's the city they grew up in, the landscapes in the country. It's the sights and sounds and smells of a place that they have a connection to. It's the cultural scripts, the kind of way that we relate to each other, which is different to how a public event takes place in Germany or Italy or even England. It's silly things like celebrities or TikTok stars. It's the everyday kind of culture that you have in a country. And I actually think that that is an incredible resource that in the United States today, despite all of the differences that we have and despite the deep political divisions that we have, we do actually have a dynamic, ever-changing, forward-looking, everyday culture which bears the mark of the contributions of people from so many different parts of the world. And so I think that our patriotism should be based in civic and constitutional values, but also in that cultural kit which connects us to each other, perhaps sometimes more than Americans recognize.
Thank you for that. So there's the problems that diverse democracies face. We talked about a little bit about the things that do pull us together, but there are the reactions to changing demographics, to greater diversity, whatever definition that takes. It's different, depending on which country you're in. You define those as turning back the clock, which we've experienced a lot in the United States with the campaign of Donald Trump, for example. The type of rhetoric that was used was very much in that line. The refuse to change identity, which I thought was really interesting because as you define it, that's not necessarily someone actively opposing diversity. It just means that they are expecting everything to stay the same. Anyone is welcome to come in, but things are going to stay as they are. And then the third one I thought interesting, you called the challenger identity. And the reason why I wanted to ask you about this specifically is that, and I'll let you define it in the way you define it in the book, but the challenger identity is one that we hear talked about a lot, whether that's people having discussions about critical race theory or whether that's talking about Black Lives Matter or any of the other social justice movements that have been going on for years, but in the public eye in the United States and internationally very much the past few years. But you talk about it with a very, you're very sympathetic to it, but you also give the reasons why this can potentially be actually damaging to diversity in the long run, which is not a perspective I've heard very often. It's usually very for or against. So I was wondering if you could talk about those reactions to diversity, but in particular, spend a little time talking about what is it that you define as the challenger identity, and why do you think that that could actually, I think the quote is that it's, an inescapable part of today's destiny, but that could actually, in the long run, end up keeping us further apart.
Yeah, great. I mean, so, we're in this situation in which not just the United States, but so many democracies around the world now are deeply ethnically and religiously diverse, and they've got to figure out how to deal with that, right? And so one way of dealing with that is to say, well, let's go back to a time when the country was more homogeneous, or when one group really had all of the rights and privileges, right? In which one group was running the show and everybody else was either had to accommodate themselves to that or was excluded in the most extreme ways. And by the way, having studied the history of diverse societies in detail, I think that is a live option. There are many societies in the history of the world which managed to sustain some amount of mutual tolerance and some amount of real cooperation for decades or centuries, and then fell apart in the most violent way. And so it's possible that that'll happen in the United States or in some other diverse democracies around the world. But we should be very clear about what that would entail. That would entail the most extreme forms of exclusion. Likely it would entail the most extreme forms of violence. And so that's a choice that on moral grounds we should fear rather than court, right? So the second thing I talk about is sort of, uh, ways in which you're not welcoming in the kinds of changes that people can legitimately ask for when they weren't part of writing the rules and they weren't part of setting a culture. I presented this book in France a couple of months ago. For some reason, French publishers are much faster than American ones. In America, if you want the book to be reviewed, you have to send reviewers the book like 4 months in advance. In France, you send it a week before, and then so for whatever reason, the book came out first in France. And there you have things, for example, like a ban on religious symbols in schools, which bans large crosses, which bans kippas for Jews, but which also bans, and this is really kind of their purpose, headscarves for girls, right? And so that's a way of saying, look, we don't want to accept the fact that with the immigration we've had and with the religious diversity we now have in this country, some of what a school class looks like might change. Some of how people dress might change. That's, I think, one kind of way of just refusing the natural consequences of having that kind of coexistence. And I think that's something on which the United States is better. I think in America, people are just a little bit less scared about seeing that kind of visual diversity, or visual manifestations of that kind of diversity. But there is also a third kind of ideology, which I feel very strongly in my milieu, and which has become, for very understandable reasons, actually, I think, the sort of center of a culture war. And that is a form of identity politics, right? It's a form of emphasizing subnational identity and the importance of that over everything else. Now, some forms of identity politics are natural, right? If you're talking about groups and groupishness, it's natural that we're going to organize in certain kinds of ways along our memberships in certain kinds of groups, right? So a really trivial example is the AARP, right? There is a way of saying, hey, there's specific interest to elderly Americans, and there should be an association that fights for those. That's a certain kind of identity politics, right? I think it's natural that that also exists for African Americans and Armenians and Jews and different kinds of groups. So that's fine. I'm not worried about that, right? What I am concerned about is when educational institutions, foundations, increasingly corporations, send the message that the most important thing about you is your skin color, is your gender, is your sexual orientation. Right? Those are all things that inform us. They're all things on the basis of which we might be discriminated against. They're all things that we should be sensitive to when somebody is saying, hey, because of the group I'm a part of, I'm not being treated in the same way, or I suffer certain kinds of disadvantages. We should take those claims very seriously and listen to them with an open and sympathetic ear. But what we shouldn't do is to send the message from on high that that's really what defines you. And I do feel that that's starting to happen. So one example of this is in many of the elite private schools around the country now. At Horace Mann in New York City, at Sidwell Friends, where presidents tend to send their kids in DC and so on. They have these affinity groups, which aren't self-chosen. These are not 15-year-olds saying, I want to have a cultural club that I go to after school. It is a teacher coming into a classroom of 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and telling them, you're black, you go over there. You're Asian American, you go over there. You're Latino, you go over there. You're white, you go over there. And then we have these separate groups in which we're trying to encourage you to think of the world through the lens of your ethnic identity. Now, the purpose of that, in many ways, is to make people aware of some of the discrimination they might suffer and make them more capable of voicing those experiences. And I get where that's coming from. But I think if you take seriously how human psychology works, it is very naive to think that this is actually going to help to have more mutual understanding, more mutual tolerance, more of a mutual sense of belonging. Because particularly for the white group, the idea is that they're somehow going to turn into these convinced anti-racists. But what we've seen again and again in these psychological studies and in history is that if you say, what defines you is your white skin, then we're going to say, well, so let's fight for interests of people who are part of my group, right? So it's just a very naive idea of how to instill solidarity. What's better, according to a vast literature on intergroup contact, is if you have a lot of contact with members of a group against whom you might be prejudiced or that have historically been in conflict with each other, you create a situation in which they're equals. Doesn't have to mean that they're already equals in the society as a whole, which sadly might not be the case. But in that situation, they're equals and they share a common goal that they can fight for. What does it look like? A sports team. Right? Very classic, not a particularly original suggestion. But that's the kind of thing where you're like, okay, look, we might have these differences. And we might be in a society where that's a real problem. But we're going to be on this team together and we're equals on the team. And that gives us the mutual trust and the mutual sort of understanding where we can open up to each other. And we can say, hey, by the way, I experienced this thing and that's a really tough thing to go through. And can you be a little bit sympathetic to that? Because you have a context in which you share an activity and a goal and build trust, rather than being separated into these separate groups and told that that's what really defines your identity. And so I do think that when I look at the culture of many elite institutions in the United States and the way they've changed over the last 5 or so years, there is this worrying tendency towards doubling down on subnational identities when we should recognize them and respect them, but also try to build towards bridges and build towards a common identity.
So we're moving into talking about the book the portion of the book where you start to address some of the potential solutions to these issues. I loved your reference to the chapter 10 problem at the end, which if you haven't yet read the book is saying that when you take on a problem this big and you get to the end, the solutions can sometimes seem a little lackluster because it's a really difficult problem, right? But you just talked a little bit about one of the potential solutions, which is bridging social gaps. Can you talk a little bit about some of the policy solutions, since we're in the U.S., maybe some of the U.S.-specific ones, but also ones that you see that might be more universal across democracies in both, Europe and other continents and the United States?
Yeah, so let me say 2 things here. So first of all, the chapter 10 problem is, I think, something that I see all of the time, right? And it's probably true with half of the wonderful authors that you get here, which is that if the book is about some big, deep, serious problem in the world, then there's probably going to be 9 chapters of a book that describe this problem and where it comes from and help you understand it and its implications and why it creates all kinds of dangers and challenges and so on. And those parts of the book are usually really good, right? And like, yeah, I'm convinced by this all sounds right. And then there's this slightly embarrassing 10th chapter where we're like, and now I pretend to tell you what to do about it. And the problem with that is that, either they say, we got to change everything, and here are these like 10 incredibly ambitious things to do. And you read that and you think, well, all of these things also have bad consequences. So like bad things might also flow from some of those changes. But let's say that we do it, we're just not going to do it. I know Congress, right? I know what American politics looks like. We're just never going to do these 10 big things. It's a non-starter, right? Or the book says, well, look, here's the 3 little things we can do. And you think, yeah, perhaps we'll manage to get 2 of those passed. But they just don't seem in the right proportion to the scale of a problem you've described. And so either way, you're kind of disappointed, right? And so I thought really hard about how can we get around the chapter 10 problem when it comes to this incredibly important project of sustaining these diverse societies and these diverse democracies, of making sure that they don't fall apart in the horrific ways that diverse societies often have in history. And I have some suggestions about public policy which basically relate to the right kinds of background conditions, right? So the way that I think about it is that if you think you've been hard done by the world, right? And you don't get what you think you deserve out of life, and you're not doing better than your parents were, and you're really afraid for the economic future of your community or your family. And you know that, if you have a stroke of bad luck in life, then you might be bankrupt or go into medical debt or, really have to live in poverty. And you have a sense that your political institutions aren't really listening to what you want, and they're completely unresponsive. And you have a public discourse where actually half a country hates you and looks down on you and all those kinds of things. well, then if you have a neighbor who moves in and he has a slightly bigger house and a slightly nicer car, and he's from a different part of the world or from a different ethnic group, it's very easy to blame them and to hate them, right? And to say, why is this guy's life going okay and my life is not going okay? If you live in a country in which you feel like you've made economic progress and you have hope and so on for the future, in which you feel like you're always going to lead a pretty dignified life, even if you get sick, even if something goes wrong in your life, in which you have a feeling that actually you have a real way of influencing politicians and institutions, and in which there's some amount of social peace, some amount of mutual respect that you feel. When it's much easier to say, oh, well, neighbor moved in and perhaps he has a nicer car, but really nice guy, and you can sort of get along with him. You don't have to become best friends, but you can have some form of mutual respect and tolerance, right? And so I have a set of suggestions which try to build economic growth and prosperity, which try to build some amount of a social safety net, which is not based around race-conscious, race-sensitive policies, but which is universal in nature, which try to make our institutions more effective, more inclusive, which try to build that kind of culture of mutual civic tolerance. So there's a whole bunch of concrete suggestions in the book. I'm not going to sort of list them all off here that speak to that. But I don't think that that's where the solution lies, right? That's part of the solution. That's part of how we don't mess it up. That's part of how we can sort of push it along a little bit. But actually, the reason why I do end up being optimistic is because of the changes that we've seen in our society over the last decades. And here, I guess I want to, you said at the beginning, you thought it was going to be an optimistic book, and then it seemed like a really pessimistic book, but then it becomes optimistic at the end. And that has a method, which is that I think when I look at the way in which many of my friends and colleagues in particular speak about this topic, they basically say, look, this should all be super easy, right? Diversity is our strength, and how hard is it not to be a bigot? How hard is it not to be racist? We should all be able to get along. And then you look at society and you see real injustices and real racism, and you see deep tensions. And then it's very tempting to say, well, so perhaps there's something uniquely wrong with us. And perhaps we haven't made any progress, and we're never going to make any progress, and we should be really pessimistic and fatalistic, right? So I think that the right way of thinking about it is exactly the other way around, which is to say what we're trying to do here is really, really hard. There's so many diverse societies in the history of the world that have gone wrong, that have turned into terrible wars and exclusion and slavery and just the worst crimes of humanity, right? But then when you look back at our society today and at our own past, you can start to recognize the progress, right? So one thing that's interesting is that within my lifetime, and you're a little young, so probably just about within your lifetime, perhaps just until a few years before you were born, a majority of Americans thought that interracial marriage was immoral, that it was immoral for a white and a black American to marry. Today, that number is down in the single digits. Depending on the polls, about 6 or 7%, right? So it's just plummeted. We know that this is not just an abstract thing, but it's actually a sociological change. It used to be that about 1 in 33 newborns in the United States were mixed race. Now it's about 1 in 7. So the ways in which we're actually coexisting at the most intimate level, starting to intertwine our fates with each other, is much more than it was in the past. When you look at immigration, there's a weird confluence of different forms of pessimism that I see on different sides of the political spectrum. So in parts of the far right, you hear these claims that, Italian and Irish immigrants 100 years ago succeeded because they were the right kinds of immigrants, but the people who are coming in today from El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya, they're not succeeding because there's something wrong with them, because they're somehow inferior, and they're not really trying, and perhaps they're not capable of succeeding, right? Now, a lot of, again, my friends and colleagues would rightly reject that and say that's completely wrong. There's nothing inferior about these immigrants coming in today, but they would actually echo the pessimism. They would say, but it's true that they're not succeeding. It's true that they're really poor and excluded, and that's because we're such a racist society, we're such a discriminatory society. Now, I do think that there is discrimination and racism that immigrants face, but when you look at the best studies, that pessimistic description is just wrong. It turns out actually that for example, immigrants acquire the language at the same speed as they do in the past and as they do in most places, which is to say there's many first-generation immigrants, the people who arrive, who they arrive as adults, and if they come from a place with less educational opportunity, never fully learn English. They might live here for decades and never fully learn English, and that exists. Their children nearly always prefer speaking English to the original language. So they usually speak both. Often in the household, their parents speak to them in the language of origin, in Spanish or Vietnamese or whatever it may be, and they respond in English. But among their siblings, among their cousins, among friends from a similar background of migration, they usually choose to speak English. And by the third generation, by the generation of the grandchildren, only about 1% of people still speak have any mastery of the original language, which is a little sad. It would be nice if they continue to have some fluency in it, right? But English actually wins such a complete victory that only 1% of the grandkids of immigrants still speak the language of origin at all. So the power of integration, whether you like it or not, however you feel about it, is much stronger than people think. And socioeconomically, it turns out that the speed at which immigrants today rise up the educational ranks, the speed at which they are integrating socioeconomically, the speed at which they're raising in wages, it's a multi-generational process. It doesn't happen from today to tomorrow, but it's the same speed with which immigrants from Ireland and Italy rose the ranks 100 years ago. And so this pessimism on which in odd ways the far right and the far left can sometimes meet is just misplaced. It's neither true, obviously, that these immigrants are somehow inferior, but nor is it true that our society is so unjust that they don't stand a shot. We should be very heartened by the fact that, in fact, they are succeeding. And so when I look at not what's going on in Congress, not what happens when I look at cable news and all of that all worries me deeply. But when I look at the changes in the heart of our society, I actually think that there's really positive developments. And if I'm optimistic in the end, if I think we can solve a chapter 10 problem, it's that we just need to maintain that and push that along. It's not that we have to find some law that completely changes everything. It's that we need to continue to double down with new resolve on the progress that we have actually been making in the midst of our society.
We're going to move to your audience questions here in just a second, so be thinking of those. But you, excuse me, you were on tour over in Europe. You mentioned that France, apparently, I did not know this, is much faster than the US at getting books published. Can you talk about the reaction to the book in the various places that you toured in Europe and anywhere else, and then in the places that you've toured in the US? Like, have you found that this is resonating with people, even if they are in different countries and different situations? Or what are even some of the critiques that you're getting that you feel the book actually works to address? How has that experience been for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that a lot of the questions and a lot of the concerns are actually similar across these different countries, which does show that for the history of the United States is quite different from the history of Western Europe in some important respects. The basic nature of a problem we now face is actually similar. And one of the things that people underestimate is how much more ethnically and religiously diverse many European societies now are than they were in the past. So actually the number of foreign-born people in Germany and Switzerland is about the same as in the United States now. And in France it's quite close. So that's something that neither Europeans nor Americans tend to think about, actually. Because America has always thought of itself as a society of immigrants, and European societies have never thought of themselves in that way, but actually they're somewhat similar in those respects today. And then there's always sort of specific questions that come in a particular context. So, perhaps also where people put my book politically varies a little bit. So in France, I think they see it as quite straightforwardly a sort of left-wing book because the social mood in France around this question is really pessimistic at the moment, which helps to explain why somebody like Marine Le Pen could get 41% of the vote and come pretty close to winning the presidency. I think in the United States, people do also note that I am critical of the more extreme ends of identity politics, and that makes sort of where this book belongs politically a little bit more complicated in the way that Americans see it. And so that's interesting, with the same sets of ideas and the same sets of arguments, where you fall on the political spectrum can sort of oddly differ from country to country. But yeah, I think some of the fundamental concerns and questions and so on actually tend to be surprisingly similar.
Thank you. My colleague Jen in the back has a mic. So again, even though we can hear you, the recording won't be able to hear you if you don't ask your question on the mic. So if you just raise your hand, she'll come to you. I know we have, it's always the first one is hard.
Anyone?
There we go.
Thank you. That's really enjoyable. I've enjoyed hearing this talk. I wanted to ask a question about, it seems to me that part of your prescription is for the nationalism or patriotism, I believe you're using those terms sort of as the same thing, of Americans to be stronger, right? For us to love our country more and to be more excited about being Americans. And there can be this, you listed 3 different ways you could do that. Sorry, this is cutting in and out. It seems to me that there's a culture, particularly with a group of more educated citizens, the sort of friends and family maybe you have, there's a global elite is a term you hear sometimes. There's that sort of culture, and then there's a culture also of almost anti sort of civic pride. Should I switch? Sorry about that. Anti-civic pride. So for example, something like, this is maybe a more contentious example, but like the 1619 Project, that's almost sort of this country has been really problematic and bad from the start, and that's built into us, and it's almost anti-be proud of being American. And so I wonder how you deal with sort of that part of the culture. Like, do you have a resolution or a suggestion for that growing civic pride, especially in a lot of the institutions that are powerful, the media, academia, that's pretty strong right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, I think there's 2 sets of fears that people have. Let me take this out of the American context for a moment, because it's a sort of funny example. I mean, in India, Narendra Modi and the governing sort of Hinduist party, Hindu nationalist party, is really, really upset about the fact that more and more Indians are celebrating Halloween. And so they're like, these people who are celebrating Halloween, they're not true Indians, and they're ruining our culture and so on, right? And so there's a kind of purism that can come more from the right that says, if our culture is changing in certain kinds of ways, then it's no longer really itself. And so we have to preserve this imagined pure idea of what the culture used to be, right? And you have some of that in the United States as well, right? People who say, perhaps they live in a less diverse place, or perhaps they live in a big city, and they say, the ways that things are changing, that's not the America I grew up in, that's not the real America, right? And so I think that's one threat to that kind of sense of common belonging. Now, I think there's also a very different kind of threat, which you're talking about, which is, everybody I've ever met in the United States is an exceptionalist. It's just that some Americans are exceptionalists and they think America is the best thing that has ever happened to the world, and others are exceptionalists because they think that America is the worst thing that has ever happened to the world. But we're all exceptionalists, right? And so there is an anti-American exceptionalism as well. And it's true that, my university president, who's actually admirable on these topics, is trying to get a democracy requirement passed. So he's trying to make sure that every undergrad who goes through Johns Hopkins has to actually take some classes on democracy to understand what our political system is and why it's valuable and why it's worth defending. A lot of faculty don't want that, because either they have other priorities, they don't think the civic stuff is important at all, or because they say, why should we defend democracy? Actually, our system is rotten, right? And you see that in many places where we teach civics a lot less. And in some places where we do teach civics, we teach a version of it, which is just to say, here's all the things that are wrong with our country, go and protest. Now, that's great. Part of citizenship is that you can reflect on what's wrong with our own country and you know how to protest if you're upset about something. But that's got to come on the basis of an appreciation for what our political institutions are and what's valuable about them and what's worth defending about them as well. So, for me, if you have collective pride in a country, that can be a very positive thing. It can be the thing that gives us the solidarity with each other. And it has to be an honest solidarity. And it has to be an honest pride in the country. And that means recognizing the bad things about it. It means being honest and upfront about it. It means knowing that the deepest sin of American history is slavery, that it did shape the society in some deep and important ways. And that that's something that, if we identify as Americans, we also should collectively feel some amount of shame and guilt about. But that also means you can have a positive identification with the good things in American history, which are also important, which are also plentiful, right? So I think that, and perhaps there again I'm influenced by being a German Jew, Germany is never going to be thinkable without the Holocaust, but Germany is not just the Holocaust. The Holocaust doesn't define Germany. You can't think Germany without it. But if we say Germany just is defined by the Holocaust and there's nothing else to Germany, that's just absurd, right? And that's the kind of way in which we should relate to nations, right? America, I don't want to say that these two things are equal, but as in every country, America needs to be upfront about the dark pasts of its past. But America can also be proud of the way in which the democratic ideals, which were implemented very imperfectly at the beginning of our republic, have spread around the world, have made the world a much better place, with a starting shot of a big rebellion against feudalism around the world. That Americans did end up abolishing slavery, that a lot of the things that are wrong with our country have been fixed by the things that are right in our country and that are right in our founding ideals. And so I think that these two things that are often put in competition with each other on both sides of the political spectrum don't need to be in competition with each other, right? I'm a proud American because I recognize the wonderful things about this country, but also because I acknowledge the things that we've gotten terribly wrong historically.
So how do you compare, say, Eastern democracies like Japan and Korea, which are relatively homogeneous, to the Western democracies, which are increasingly heterogeneous in terms of their social progress? How would you characterize that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, sort of my book is not an argument for diverse democracy, right? In the sense that if you're Japan or if you're Bulgaria, and you still have a relatively homogeneous country, it's not my place to tell you whether you should have more immigrants or not, right? Now, not having more immigrants in both of those countries has some real disadvantages. These are depopulating societies, where in some ways not very dynamic societies. Having immigration would have some benefits. But there are also societies that are built around a very strong culture and that probably would really struggle with some of the changes that brings. And we know some of the dangers that kind of diversity can also have for the stability of a country. So it's not for me to tell Japanese politicians or Bulgarian politicians or voters what they should do, right? My book is about the great majority of democracies that already is deeply diverse, right? The United States and Brazil and India and Germany and France and Australia and Britain. These are already deeply diverse countries and societies and democracies. And so my book is a guideline for how we make that work, right? For how we sustain that, for how we make sure that these societies don't fall apart in the worst kinds of way. So that's just sort of as a proviso. Now, it's interesting to look at those societies. I mean, I think that for a long time they had a little bit more political harmony because it's sort of easier when you don't have these big ethnic or religious divisions. But actually, over the last couple of decades, in part as a result of social media, they have become much more polarized as well. So South Korea just had an election. Well, first of all, Korea is split between the South and the North, not along ethnic lines, not along religious lines, but as a result of a terrible civil war, right? So that's one kind of division that is very extreme. But even within South Korea, which was a dictatorship for a long time, then became a really thriving, energetic, dynamic democracy that worked quite well, you now have this very, very deep cultural and political polarization. And the last election really was sort of nastier and more full of rancor and more full of mutual distrust than the politics of Korea has been for a good number of decades. So I think some things are easier when you don't have to worry about people weaponizing these ethnic and religious differences against each other. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a smooth ride. And Korea and to some extent Japan are evidence of that.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I want to share something in support of what you mentioned. When I was in college, I just suggested for them to have a program where you partner people, like, of different race, so that then they can both learn from each other, like a mentoring program. And nobody is teaching the other person, but they are teaching only their side of culture or whatever, and the other party is teaching their side of the culture, so that then they could both learn, and they would meet in different places, like maybe restaurants or anywhere they like, but they are like building a friendship together. And that particular program really was very popular. And I was remembering that when you just mentioned about not separating people, but to put them together. So this is not a question, but I'm sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
No, and there's plenty and plenty of evidence for this that intergroup contact can really work very well if it is precisely in the context of a program like that, right? Where it's like the idea is to get along, to learn about each other. You're equals in this. You're like going out for a meal together. It's not me teaching you or you teaching me. It's I teach you and you teach me. There's a kind of exchange. And I do think that one of the sort of strangest things about the development of some of American culture and some of the American left is this sort of this odd doubling down on identity as something and on the difference between identities as something to be celebrated, right? No, look, again, I think that we are groupish. We're always going to have groups in society, right? My idea is not that of a melting pot in which everybody becomes indistinguishable from each other. And I don't think that we'll ever have the kinds of, free-flowing individuals that perhaps I imagined when I was 20 years old. We are going to have groups in society, and that's fine. That's perfectly great. It's one of the things I love about America, actually. But that'll come naturally to people always. What we need to do through political institutions, but also through cultural and educational institutions, through the work of things like the History Center, through schools and universities and foundations, is to get people to also build connections with each other and build trust with each other. One thing I talk about in this book is this big debate about what's called cultural appropriation, right? And I think the concerns about cultural appropriation get the plausibility from the fact that they often describe situations that are unjust or that have been unjust, right? So one example that's often used is all of the great black singers and artists in the 50s and 60s who couldn't have big careers because a lot of concert halls wouldn't let them perform, because record labels wouldn't sign them up. And so then white artists came in and stole their songs and had big careers with them and profited off of it. That's obviously unjust, right? Where I'm skeptical is that the term of cultural appropriation is the right way to express what's unjust about the situation. There's a much more straightforward way of putting what's unjust about that situation, which is simply, A, the discrimination, the fact that they weren't allowed to perform those concert halls, that the record labels did not want to sign them up, and then B, intellectual property theft, right? There's an individual who wrote a song, and a different individual took that song and used it for their own purposes, right? There's very straightforward ways of describing what was wrong with that. Now, what I call mutual cultural influence is in fact a positive thing. A lot of nearly every invention in the history of the world bears the influence of different cultures coming together. Is based on different stages of the evolution of human culture, where one part of it is invented in one country, another in another country, and then often it comes together somewhere where cultures meet. Nearly everything we wear, everything, the way we write, everything is a mark of that kind of mutual cultural influence. And so what I worry about when people say, oh, cultural appropriation is bad, is not just that they misdescribe what makes some of those real injustices bad, but that it makes us apprehensive about the things we need to make our society work, right? It's a good thing when we forge new cultural forms of expression that build on the influences of different people within our societies. To use a really silly example, there was this big summer hit a few years ago called Old Town Road, which is a mix of lots of different musical styles from country to R&B and so on. That to me is America, and that's a positive thing about America. That's not something to be concerned about, that this artist appropriated country music for himself. That is one of the parts of the kind of dynamism of our everyday culture that we should be celebrating.
Hey, how's it going? Hi, back here, yeah. So, first off, I have not read your book yet. I'm excited to read it, but thank you for telling me about chapter 10. I was reading it back here, and great stuff. Love it. So my big question is, when, as societies are shifting over time, especially in healthcare fields or in the finance fields, what will happen when the class shifts start getting further and further, and maybe resources could become more scarce, or access to these things become more, across those socioeconomic lines? And does this have a threat to democracy?
Yeah, so, again, I'm an immigrant to this country, but, I'm an immigrant who had an easy start in my life in this country. I came for grad school. I mean, for 7 years, I didn't make very much money while I was in grad school, but, I was living a very nice life on a campus and so on. I had no complaints. And when I reflect on sort of my journey in this country, I find that the truth of it is a little bit different from how a lot of my colleagues would describe it, or what the assumption is in a lot of the media, right? So my circle of friends and acquaintances and colleagues is really pretty ethnically and religiously diverse. It could always be a little bit more diverse, and it's always good to be a little bit self-critical and self-introspective about that. But really, the people I know in this country come from all kinds of different ethnic and religious groups, or all kinds of different national backgrounds. This country has become very naturally diverse, including in its elite circles, right? I don't think I know anybody in this country, essentially, who hasn't gone to college, right? I don't know many people who didn't go to elite colleges. I don't know many people who didn't go to selective colleges, who didn't go to grad school. And that tells us something about the extent to which, a part of America has really closed itself off from the rest of the country. And it really is more along socioeconomic lines than it is along those lines of identity. And so, I have to say I was astounded every now and again by, Tom Lehrer, this wonderful comedian from the 1960s, has this great line where he says, it's very important to like your fellow human beings, and some people in the world do not like their fellow human beings, and I hate people like that. And I was astounded sometimes by, the way in which people in my socioeconomic milieu think of themselves as the enlightened, tolerant people, assume that everybody else is sort of terrible and bigoted, and then have a real callousness for average people. I think for the compatriots, right, for the majority of our fellow citizens, I think a form of that was visible during the pandemic. Now, most Americans chose to get vaccinated and all of that. I think the people who did not choose to get vaccinated, that's a tragedy to me, right? Because the vaccines are effective and are allowing us to be here together safely and all of that. But actually it turns out that the biggest risk that people who aren't getting vaccinated are taking is for themselves. And so I have great compassion for people who, for whatever reason, have come to what I regard as a false conclusion that it's a bad idea to take the vaccines, and who might end up getting seriously sick, or who might end up dying when that would have been preventable. That to me is a tragedy. And yet I read in the pages of big newspapers, and I hear sometimes from people in my social circle, they have it coming to them. You know, who cares about that? These terrible people, these terrible opinion, why should I care if bad things happen to them? I think that's a form of disdain that's just really, really bad, I think. And one thing that I've started to think about in terms of democracy is that part of democracy is to sometimes despair of your fellow citizens, right? Like part of democracy is, yeah, the majority gets to decide, and sometimes the majority gets it wrong, and why on earth did they get it wrong, right? That's perfectly fine. That's normal, right? But you do have to have a kind of bottom line trust that most people, most of the time, are responsive to moral considerations. That most people, most of the time, are actually capable of being persuaded. That most people, most of the time, when something is seriously wrong, can recognize that something is wrong and can share with you the intention of remedying that. And if you don't have that, I think it's hard to be a small d Democrat, right? It's hard to believe in democracy in a real way. And on that criterion, a lot of my friends don't believe in democracy. And that worries me.
Thank you. One of the things that's been proposed and is done in many countries to kind of give people experience with other parts of their country is either 1 or 2 years of military service as a young person, or a variety of service opportunities, but everybody has to serve in some way. Whether it's a conservation corps, think all the examples. And as I recall some of the things I've heard about World War II, part of the exposure to the world and to other people happened, in troops and that. And so, and part of what I've run into is that many people who have served in some capacity, their lifelong friendships come out of that, right? So I wonder what you observe about that, or have you looked at that as part of sustaining democracy?
Yeah, what's interesting about this is not just that I think it's a very good idea, but actually how often it comes up. People, I think, really want this sense of we need to have institutions and opportunities for people in this country to come into contact with each other. And an awareness of the fact that we don't anymore, right? An awareness of the fact that, look, a college like Johns Hopkins, where I teach, is actually very good at recruiting talented students from all over the country and all of that. But even if it takes somebody from, a poor family in Appalachia, or even if it takes somebody from, the south side of Chicago who grew up in real poverty, then they take them to this campus at the age of 18 and they never encounter a normal person again for the next 40 years of their lives. I'm slightly exaggerating, right? But they'll be around other people who are destined for high-end jobs, large pay. They'll go on and live in big metropolitan centers where everybody is affluent. And by the time that they're powerful and influential in society, they've actually lost contact with their origins. They go back, for Christmas and Thanksgiving, but that's it. And so thinking about ways in which we can deepen these social connections, I think, are really important. Now, I don't think they should be mandatory, right? I don't think that sort of in order to social engineer in these kinds of ways, we can force people to spend a year or two in their lives in the military or in some kind of form of national service. But I do think that we can have a generous program that gives people opportunities to do exciting and interesting things, and that at least gets a large cohort of Americans at a formative young age to have those kind of experiences and to draw them out from where they're at. And the very minimum we can do is to use the institutions we already have. Again, this is not going to be a big difference, but I'm very saddened by the fact that many colleges no longer assign roommates randomly. Right? This is one of the places where these friendships used to form, right? Where like the kid from the farm in Iowa and the kid from Harlem would end up being roommates in the first year, and perhaps they hated each other, but perhaps they really made a friendship, right? And that actually doesn't happen in many colleges anymore because they allow students to request for roommates. And so who do they request? The kid from the high school, the kid they met at the local meetup. Before they join the college, people who are much more likely to be similar to them across a whole bunch of dimensions, right? So let's have these ambitious programs, but are voluntary for national service and things like that. And let's use the institutions we already have to connect people to each other across difference.
Please join me in thanking tonight's guest, Yascha Mounk.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will meet all of you out in the lobby. If you pre-bought your book, it is pre-signed, but Yascha's happy to personalize it for you if you'd like. If you have not yet gotten your copy, again, they are 25% off. So thank you again for joining us at Atlanta History Center tonight. Be safe going home, and we hope to see you again soon.